One of the things the History Center does is collect stories that are relevant not just to Lake Forest, but nationally. Lake Forest is emblematic of a larger American narrative, and one of those major stories is the development of housing. And we look at it through three lenses: the architect and his relationship with the owner. A lot of decisions that were made during those years were a link between the way the architect envisioned homes and the way the owner wanted to use the home. It's also evocative of the way he saw himself within society. The window at the beginning of the century becomes a booming era for the development of Lake Forest. It makes a statement about where we are going with a society. Those stories are important to understand how we get here. And a lot of what we're doing with what we gather at the History Center is grounding the past to the present and the present to the future. Because if we do not understand that arc, we do not know where we are going. And that's an incredible value to the population to better understand their role in community and society, and to think about where we want to be in the future based on where we have been in the past.
And I had seen just about every house in Lake Forest, and this one just stopped me dead in my tracks with my dog. And I had said, that's the one. I thought it was situated perfectly on the street, and I loved everything about it. That it was really, really majestic and quiet looking. And I appreciated the architecture, and I had felt that if it could be home, we'd try to make it one. And you'll see before and after photos before we began to tear the place apart and restore it thoughtfully. From the outside, you could see there was tremendous potential, but it had been neglected for quite some time. And we had felt that if we could give it new life, we would. And so we did. We call her The Lady. The house is dubbed The Lady. And we wanted to make sure that she could have a new life, and a life that could withstand the test of time. The property here kind of hides its secrets from the street. It's got trees up front, gorgeous linden trees that pretty much preserve the home's integrity. It doesn't give away all of its secrets immediately. And that to us is tremendously imperative. Our house has a soul.
Lake Forest provided a landscape that worked well for an architectural design. The curvilinear streets, the ravines, working around the land instead of trying to flatten the land. There were a lot of natural features that they could focus on. You have Lake Michigan, which is an amazing vista. You have it sitting on a bluff from Lake Michigan. You have the ravines, which are a unique and incredibly beautiful backdrop to some of these estates. It created privacy on the estate. There was a lot of land that went with it. So they were able to enact a vision unencumbered by some of the things they would have run into on the East Coast. And because of that, if you're a student of architecture and you really want to see American architecture at its finest, particularly if you're looking at grand estates, Lake Forest is it.
So when you come in here, it's more of a quiet home. It doesn't have a particularly large ceiling. It's more compact and cozy. We kept all of the incredible details of this home. Here's the original Moorish Moroccan flooring, which I think is just absolutely spectacular. You'll see we still have the solid original German silver hardware, and you wind up coming into the main entry vestibule entrance, which has large, large ceilings, and they're original in size. Here we have the Gracie wall coverings, which were absolutely custom for this home. You can see it was per square that they put up, and I think it's probably one of the most exquisite features of the home.
Most people who appreciate 1920s residential architecture in America know about Harrie Lindeberg. He worked in Lake Forest, did a number of beautiful houses there, as well as a clubhouse for the Onwensia Club.
The club directors at Onwensia wanted to bring in an outside architect. They didn't want to offend any of the local architects by not giving them the commission.
Quite a coup for him to take that away from David Adler, who was the #1 architect in Chicago at the time.
There are only 4 houses that we know of that were Lindeberg homes. One of the things that we look at when we look at who came in and why is that we were able to, because of the status of a lot of our homeowners, pull in great talent from all over the country.
I wasn't looking for a Lindeberg particularly. We were looking for something that was old, historic, and had that wow factor. And we felt this one ticked all those boxes. It wasn't until acquiring this property that we did more research as to who the architect was, who the home was built for, and then compared and contrasted to the other famous architects in the area, which would be Howard Van Dorenshaw, David Adler, and Lindeberg, for me, I think is the ultimate architect. And it's a true privilege to be able to live amongst, a livable work of art like this.
He was practicing in an era where there were a lot of very talented and skilled architects who were very much affected by the war in Europe. And then following the war in Europe, you had the beginning of the Roaring Twenties, which it's funny to me to look at the work that he's done as a backdrop for what was happening in society then. It was a really uproarious time. He was very much in the swim of that. And I think any architect who had the kind of success he had to be able to move very smoothly with that group of highly polished, culturally sophisticated, and for the most part, very rich people.
Lake Forest in the 1920s actually had some of the most growth that it ever had. The population doubled from 3,000 to almost 6,000 from 1920 to 1930. The land area tripled. They annexed territory to the west during this period in the 20s. Market Square was built in 1916. It was the first planned shopping center in the nation to incorporate automobile traffic. The Deer Path Inn was built in the late 20s. The Deer Path movie theater was built, and people's lifestyles had sort of been a little bit more extravagant in the 20s, and so this became a much more substantial community. Going into the 1930s, you have the Skokie Highway, which was built. Multiple train lines. People were starting to see Lake Forest a little bit more as potentially a permanent home as opposed to just a summer home.
Here now we have our dining room, the way it used to look. This dining room I think is just absolutely gorgeous. We have this painting here, the Port of Sèvres, as well as our William Kent table. And then here is our loggia, kind of had a very rustic feeling. It just didn't really go with the house, and we decided to elevate its taste. It was important to us because this room is filled with such light, and it's absolutely stunning, and it looks over the formal gardens outside. And it's now turned into our living room gallery. And it wasn't until someone had told me that this was the Dexter-Cummings residence, I mean, I hadn't even done research that far, and that piqued my interest into the historical center to do the real research to find out, where did they come from, why they picked Lake Forest, and kind of to be in there a shell of a home that they founded.
Ground was broken in fall of 1929 on the Dexter-Cummings house, mostly complete by April of 1930. Mark Cummings built a Lake Forest summer home in 1903 on the lake side at the very north end of Lake Road. So that house is called Ioka, and that's where Dexter Cummings and his sister Edith Cummings would have grown up. His property was subdivided from his parents' estate, so he and his new wife Emily could build a house.
The Cummings family are an interesting family to study. Edith Cummings is one of what we called the Big Four, and they were the socialites who grew up and became young women in the 19-teens. And it's clear from the way Edith's life unfolded that she grew up in a family that was very progressive, that they really looked at life and where she should be very differently, and it is clear her brother who owned this estate would have had that same exposure and experience. Edith's father makes the decision that she should not have to marry for money, that she should be an independent woman. He sets her up in a way that allows her to successfully explore her interests, which turn out to be golf. Edith becomes the first sportswoman ever on the cover of Time magazine, and she gets written up in a way that only a spurned lover will write up people, F. Scott Fitzgerald, as the Jordan Baker character, where he makes her sort of cynical and a cheat. She was neither. But the Cummings family clearly looked at where the 20th century was taking them and their decisions around the house, around the way it's constructed, around the way they presented their life to be a more progressive one. There's an element to it that is just the elegance of the estate and the way it appeared and the way it looked, and that gets into the architecture and the design and the decorations. But the other part of it, and it's a big part of it, is the stories that lived within those walls. Who was there? How did they live their life? How did it differ from mine? How is it the same as mine? And all of those blend together in the stories that we tell when we're really looking at the idea of every house has a story.
Our library is a stunning work of art, I think, but the wood was in bad condition. This house had been neglected, and the only way we decided we could preserve it would be to lacquer the study itself, so we did. It has all the original details that Lindeberg had with this exquisite library. I'd like to think Dexter-Cummings spent a lot of time in here. This home needed TLC, just desperately, and we had felt that we could give it to it. It's loved us back for it, bizarre as that sounds. So here we have what I call the papal suite. We found this bed in Italy, in Verona, and had it brought here. We found these tables in Prague.
In hiring Lindeberg, the Cummings family makes a decision about why they want to use this particular designer whose attention to detail and sort of reinterpretation of early modernism was critical to what the Cummings wanted in the way they built their estate. And it's always telling to look at who an owner chose when they were deciding how to build their home. And so that Lindeberg decision says something about the way that estate unfolded.
The houses he designed were great mixtures of classical, vernacular, Art Deco, architectural styles, and his planning was extremely modern for the time. It's funny to me to look at the work that he's done. It's so timeless in a way. It's so, for the most part, very reserved, very elegant.
There's much more individuality to each of the homes than there might be to another designer, particularly of that era. When you hire Frank Lloyd Wright, you get a Frank Lloyd Wright house. It is very much Frank Lloyd Wright's vision. Lindeberg was more fluid. He pulled in from more reference points, and he accommodated, I think, more unique design integration based on what the owner wanted.
One of the nice things about that is that the houses continue to, for the very most part, to be very happily lived in today.
And you can see in the renovation work a lot of that desire for what was originally intended coming back to life.
So what do you think Lindeberg's reaction would be to the work you've done?
I think he'd be blown away, honestly, perhaps flattered that somebody had taken such a keen interest into a home that he built 100 years ago, that we've restored it to perfection, and that we've honored him and his legacy by keeping everything important intact and in place. I think he'd be happy coming back all these years later, seeing that the gardens have been restored back to how he intended it for his clients, the Cummings. So I would hope and do verily believe that he would be enthused.
It's been something that we can't always count on, but it is always rewarding to see when a new owner comes in and maintains that sense of stewardship, that critical attachment to history in the way that they renovate and they reshape their home. That Chase is so young and doing this, I think, is a great tribute to this generation and where we are going, because it is clear through his efforts that stewardship remains top of mind to a lot of the folks that are inheriting everything that we have to offer and are carrying it into the future.
I think the story of this house brings together a lot of, really fascinating Lake Forest stories. The timing of when it was built, I think, is fascinating. This community's sort of prominence in the 1920s and the Roaring 20s culture, the Depression, and how that affected or did not affect people in Lake Forest. Being connected to, a significant national architect in Harrie Lindeberg, the connection with F. Scott Fitzgerald, this woman who became a national figure sort of in her own right as an athlete, really a pioneering figure. You can go in a lot of different directions and tell so many different stories from that.
If we lose history, we lose ourselves. And I think it's important to memorialize who did live here and how they lived.
And I think the fascination for the public is this glimpse backwards, this ability to look back in time and see how daily life did function. It explains the continuing interest in historical dramas, both fictional and non-fictional, and the way we look back on who came before us, because it does help us understand why we are where we are today.
So one of the things in looking at this and as watching that video again, so it's 1929, 1930, right? At this point, the Roaring Twenties are starting to end, but you still have the society life in which summer parties, events, celebrations are still part of it. One of the things that was really striking in walking through the house, there are two aspects of it. One is that it faces away from the lake. You've got when you think about the sort of fly-ins that you're getting, that driveway is the lake side of the house. The courtyard, the U, faces west. And so while the Cummings didn't leave a whole lot of written literature about how they used the house, Greg and I have talked about what can you see out of the design for the way that house would have been used? Because they didn't have a grand ballroom. They didn't have a lot of sort of interior space for people to gather in. They couldn't have thrown a big 100-person party inside the house.
You're throwing that to me.
I'm totally throwing that to you. Again, speculation. You're just
reading
the text.
I need to do a sound check here. Is this loud enough, too loud? A little loud, that's what I thought.
Can you turn
I can turn
on
it
and
down.
down? Well, actually, we could turn the entire sound system down.
Can you still hear?
Is that better?
A little more conversational.
Okay.
A little more conversation. Yeah, Carol, I think it is a very interesting house. And I talked about this a little bit the other night, if any of you were here for that. It's a one-room deep house, and it has a very, very spread out plan. So when you're in the house, all of the spaces feel entirely discrete from each other. If you're in the living room, you're in the living room. If you're in the library, you're in the library. If you're in the dining room, you're in the dining room. And it kind of never the twine shot. I mean, there's a lot of space between those rooms, too. So I think what you're saying is that it doesn't necessarily feel like a house that flows easily for a party.
Right. One of the things that was striking about it is, in most of the houses in that area, you would connect from room to room to room directly. And in this case, you literally walk into a room, you have to walk back out to the hallway, and that hallway actually runs the inside of that U shape on the back part of it. So think train design, where you basically have cars and then the hallway. That is how this is structured. And so the large glass presence is actually the hall. And then you have the windows on the driveway side, or for many of the rooms, that's the one light that's in there besides the hall light.
Yeah, and one of those are sort of private rooms. Another really unusual thing about the plan of this house is if you look at virtually all of David Adler's houses and virtually all of Harrie Lindeberg's houses, there will be a big living room. This house has a beautiful library, a dining room, and then some sort of great hall and stair hall. That's typically often a sunroom. And they're all, the dining room sort of ends that group of rooms, because then you go from the dining room to the pantries, to the service areas and those various rooms. In this house, you pass through the dining room with all these other rooms, the stair hall, the library, the living room, this great gallery to your left. You turn right, you go through the dining room. But then you pass through the dining room, there's a little anteroom of some sort. And then there's this great loggia that kind of comes out of nowhere. A line of arched French doors that you saw Chase talking about, and then kind of changing the look of that and getting rid of those, the dark wood and glamming it up. But then at the very end of that, you go through this long, I would say, at least 30-foot long loggia, and you find this octagonal, just kind of a snug little den. And it's so cozy and unusual to have an octagonal room. And just a little background on me in this house. There's only one small picture, black and white picture of this house in any of the monographs on Lindeberg. For years I thought this is such a cool looking house, it's fascinating. And I visited Lake Forest a number of years ago and I found it as I was peering into the street. And so the minute I downloaded Google Earth, probably 10 years ago, I thought, I'm going to Lake Forest and I'm going to go up in the air and see what's back behind that house. And here I saw these two really long wings. I mean, it's a wide house when you look at it from the road. But I saw these two long wings coming out back, and one of them ended in an octagonal turret. That was interesting. It's like you kind of tell, looking at the plan. It's where the service wing should be. And yet, clearly, this is not part of the service wing. This is something special. And it really is something special. And I was talking to Steve Solomon, who wrote the book, The Country House that David had. And he knew the people who owned it before Chase, and he had been in the house. And he said, well, that room, that octagonal room, as it still is kind of a comfy little den, but the room above it was a children's playground. So my guess is that that whole wing, kind of above the loggia on that end of the house, was the children's bedroom wing. Then there were adult bedrooms and guest rooms over the main block of the house. And then they had that fantastic playroom and that balcony overlooking the garden. So anyway, yeah, it's a very unusual plan. There's nothing else that I know of in his oeuvre that's quite like it. And
well, and it is such an interesting design. And then the other part of the loggia, in looking at that, is that they've got these beautiful sort of French doors, which makes me think that their parties were summer parties. And that would have been the room you would have staged in, and then you would have gone out into the courtyard garden afterward. Because, we've talked about, for a lot of these families, they weren't here all year long, particularly in this era. This was their summer residence, and then they would either have a place in Chicago or elsewhere, depending on where they were from. And so, it really is only in the 30s that you start to see it becoming a permanent residence or permanent home for a lot of the families. But everything about this house looks like it was designed for summer entertaining and summer gathering.
yeah, we did talk about this. And I was talking to a friend the other day about, I've done a lot of work in New York City, and it was a real eye-opener for me to realize I went into this really grand apartment on Park Avenue in the evening for a party. I got dragged along, and it was so spectacularly decorated. The firm called Denning and Forcott, who were around in the 60s and 70s. Just unbelievable use of color. I then saw an apartment in the daytime, and it looked like a screaming tacky mess. And I realized this apartment was 100% decorated to only ever be seen by lamplight. It was so out of control color-wise in daylight, but when we came in, and I thought, none of these people in the Park Avenue building set foot in them from Memorial Day to Labor Day. They were somewhere else. And by the time anybody got there for dinner, when they were living in the apartment, it was dark out. So it was really interesting to me. And Carol and I were talking about this house and thinking, well, this was a summer colony. So the weather was nice. This house was built in a U shape around an amazing garden. And so, yeah, probably a lot of their entertaining was very much open in and out, like the space out there, and it's absolutely lined with French doors. This whole U is completely lined with French doors. I just imagine them having these great summer parties with all French doors open and bars set up inside and caterers or whatever. And but really, the big parties happening with the sun setting to the west, and they were kind of daylight. It was the daylight, it was the summer thing. So,
I mean, it's fascinating too because you're so close to the lake, but they don't build for a lake view. They also don't build to really be seen from the street. I mean, there's a privacy aspect to the entire design that's like, you know me or you don't know me, and we're not doing anything showy. And then the other thing, and again, I don't know enough about Lindeberg's design to know whether or not this is standard, but the other thing that was really striking walking through the house is the stairway up to the second floor is hidden.
It's concealed, yeah.
You don't like the idea that that's anything, there's no majestic, spiral staircase. It's a beautiful staircase, but it is down the hall and in a room. You don't see it if you're just going to the party.
Yeah. No, it is. It's a mysterious house. You really have to go through multiple spaces before you find any of the main spaces. So, and even, I think as Chase suggested, and you were just sort of implying, the front is rather foreboding. I was talking the other night about, Wentzia Club, and say, on Wentzia Club, the least welcoming club I've ever laid eyes on, just a wall with a door. And this is a little bit similar in that it's a very, very solid entrance facade, not a lot of windows, solid doors, it doesn't say, hey, come sit on the porch at all.
No. In fact, there is not really a porch. You've got the brick wall at the street level, and then it is gravel all the way up to the not particularly large front door. And so not only is it not inviting, but it's also not particularly ornamental in any way that makes you feel like, right, it is an austere sort of, initial entrance into the building.
And if I can speak a little bit to Lindeberg's history in Lake Forest, he did 9 projects in Lake Forest and the Bluff. And I'm pretty sure this was the last house he did. When we saw this in the video that it was completed in 1930, started in 29. The first house, I think, he did was the Clyde Carr House, which is down on Lake Road. And the difference is kind of stunning. And I think Clyde Carr was done maybe 1919, maybe 1920, very early. It's a much friendlier looking house. It's got this incredibly beautiful bronze and brass screen that is the entrance porch. And drive up to that, it's like, what is this magical place I've come to? And it's also almost like a fairy tale house in terms of its massing with turrets and bay windows. And so the change to me, to watch Lindeberg's progression, his own taste, over those 10 years between Clyde Carr, he did a house, the Vibrant House, which is just a storybook cottage. You just want to hug it. It's so sweet. And then to see him by 1930 doing this, as you were saying in your spiel in the video, it's really quite a modern house. It's very severe. The detailing is incredibly crisp, simple. He does almost all of the detailing just with the material and with the brick. There's very little ornamentation on the house, but it's very strong. Again, it's sort of foreboding. The front, and then the garden is just, the garden really does envelop you. You get into that garden, it's like, you just love it.
Yeah, I mean, beautiful arched doorways, everything is very inviting, but it's very private. It's very much,
completely private.
Focused on people I know and my family. I had a chance, like a year ago, I remember, to go do the mansion up in Hyde Park, Vanderbilt. And one of the things that they were talking about in that tour that was so fascinating is what happens with all the various Vanderbilt estates, which, they threw just extravagant parties. They would spend $100,000 in 1920 dollars on decorating for each individual party. There were themes, there were all this stuff. By 1930, with the crash and with the Depression, those places are seen as albatrosses, that they are signs of extravagance and excess, and there's a shift. So that house was built in 1890-something for $2 million in those dollars, and when the niece inherits it after both of them have passed away, she can't sell it for $100,000. She can't. Well, and that was one of the things, right, and so, you know, in the conversation that she had with Roosevelt about the estate, when he talks her into donating it to become a national park, his thing was, if you sell it to anybody, they will knock it down, they're gonna put up 4,000 houses. If you wanna maintain the land as it is, the only way to do it is to donate it because no one is buying it, it's unseemly. And it's interesting to look at that shift, and, you know, Lake Forest doesn't seem to have as much of that ripple effect as the East Coast did. But, you know, when looking at Lindeberg and looking at Adler, how much did that play into their revision design work following 1930 was that it was seen as unseemly to have grandiose estates.
Right, they both started simplifying their work quite a bit after that. And it may have been a monetary thing, too. People may just have not had the money.
Right.
To spend. But also didn't really know what they were.
Right.
What
Showcase.
made in people's faces is they were built and brick.
Well, and it's interesting because this house was really built right in that window of time, right? They started in 29, but it's completed in 30, and you wonder, was anything shifted in the design work of it because of this, or do you think that it started with a plan and ends with a plan?
I bet it went straight through. I mean, it's very fully realized design.
One of the things you mentioned in the other lecture on Thursday night was that the courtyard side of the house only has 3 second-story windows going across it. The opposite side
7.
had 7.
Yeah.
Same space,
Right.
just,
And it was then later explained to me that there's a whole, I never got up to the second floor when I was lucky enough to go in. It's a long hall, so it didn't need a lot of penetration. But it does, it makes a big difference. I mean, one would have expected 5 windows across the front of that house. I would like that, I hope 5 windows across there.
There was another question?
So about the garden and the garden parties, I'm wondering if maybe they tented out beyond the garden during those parties?
What is
Is
the
there any
garden
kind of
like
evidence
this?
for that?
I don't know if there's any evidence. There certainly is the lawn space for it. You know, when you look at sort of the original lawn design, so at the top, right above the fireman hat, is the original plan for the grounds, and you can see the courtyard there, and then you can see this massive expanse of lawn. And so if it wasn't tented, then there probably would have been garden activities, you know, croquet, whatever. But it is clear that it's designed to bleed out into that lawn space in significant ways. So if I'm gathering people, that's where I'm going to be pushing them, because the courtyard, even then, was still relatively tightly packed with plantings.
I'm curious how many bathrooms are in the home, and also where the staff quarters might be.
Is it on?
Sorry about that.
It's not turning on? Nope. Now it is. It's on delay. It's my magic touch with all things electronic.
Carol's going to do all the rest of the talking.
All right, so I actually asked the exact same question this morning. How many bathrooms are there? So the answer was 7?
there,
6?
there were, well, the way it's designed now is the bathroom, or the bedroom, there's one at each end of the U, looking out on the garden. Then you come in on the master side, and there's a huge, huge closet, and you go through that into a study. Those 3 are all in a row on the upper floors. Across the middle are 2 more bedrooms, maybe 3. Each has its own bathroom. Yeah, and then the wing where the children's playroom was is now a sitting room with a bedroom attached, and then there's 1 more bedroom there. So those are all the family bedrooms, and then there's a wing that comes towards the road, which is all the help. And I think there were 5 bedrooms in there.
And there were only 2 bathrooms on the first floor, correct? Half bath right by the front door. Is there
Yes.
another one by the kitchen?
Yes, there's one over by the kitchen.
So And then your second question was bathrooms we covered, and then,
Staff quarters.
so yes, we think that there were, in
Yeah,
fact,
maybe five, but
staff bedrooms.
probably quite small, 8 by 10 or something.
And it had a sink in them rather than a full
Yeah.
bathroom.
But where were they located?
On this, so it is the second
They
floor.
are in the wing that comes out on the right side of the house. So that the kitchen is over on the right side. So it was very clear in those construction photos, the black and white photos that were in the video just now. You could see this long, very plain wing coming out on the very right-hand side with a bunch of little windows on the second floor. That's where all those rooms are, or still are.
What can you tell us about Dexter-Cummings and the family? Did he work? How many kids do they have? What sort of life? What do we know about?
So this is where it's unfortunate that Lori is not here because she knows all of this. I mean, what I know a little bit about it, but like those sort of details. So Dexter and his sister basically raised here. They divide the property so Dexter can buy a place. Edith never builds here. She's traveling basically as a golfer for the next decade. He marries, I don't know how many kids they have, but they basically raise them here. And I believe he continues with his dad's business. I know he ends up being a man of some means of his own, but I don't know. I don't know if he continues on with the railroad or if he moves on in a different direction. They were very, very private. I will say that. There's not a lot written about that side of the family. There's a lot about Edith only because of her sport. And again, the focus from the F. Scott Fitzgerald angle really sort of keeps lays on her for a while.
Well, that's part of the Ginevra King.
Right, that's part of the big four. They're such, I'm sure most of you know about this, right? There are 4 young women who basically in 1917 decide that the way to get the best possible husbands is to brand themselves. Like they are modern young women. And they brand themselves the big four. They create their own marketing campaign that basically puts them up as being the socialites to know. And they're here in Lake Forest. And they're really interesting women. Each of them goes off in a different direction, but Ginevra King is the one that F. Scott Fitzgerald comes in. It's like his freshman year at Princeton, he comes in and he falls in love with her. And she is beautiful. There's a photo of her right there under the pencil sharpener. And she's quite the vivacious young woman, and she courts him, or he courts her, very mutual for a while, for 3 years. And at some point, her father basically sits her down and says, you are marrying somebody who can take over my business, and it is not F. Scott Fitzgerald. And Fitzgerald was just not happy about this, right? He's peeved because he's like, oh, she can't marry me because I'm poor. Well, in fact, I believe he declares bankruptcy twice, so Dad was right not to break with the money. But he is so hurt by her rejection of him that she's embedded in many of his female characters, including Daisy Buchanan. And then, of course, he pulls Edith into that as well. And then the other two, Courtney Letts is a really fascinating young woman, and I would love to just do an exhibit on her. She decides that she is going to go on a grand adventure. She marries at 18 and then decides she is exploring the Arctic. And she takes, in 1933, a film crew to the North Pole. They just showed it actually a couple of years ago, her documentary at the Field Museum. She goes to Argentina, she divorces and then marries another man there who becomes the Argentinian ambassador to Spain. She goes to Spain. Like, she is a modern woman. But the 4 of them definitely sort of carved their own paths. And the Cummings was, Edith's dad was the one who basically said, you don't have to marry for money. You will never have to marry for money. And she doesn't marry until she's in her 30s. And she marries for love, and she is the only of the 4 that remains married for her life to the same man.
Are you aware of any traces of the Cummings family in recent decades in Lake Forest?
No, I do not know whether or not there's descendants here. Again, Lori, if she were here, we'd know that. Any other questions? Anything else that we can touch touch on that you think would help illuminate this house?
I've been trying to think. I think I've kind of I've brought what I can bring.
Can you explain how you got into the love of Lindeberg?
Well, I mean,
some of the people were here Thursday night.
yeah, I don't want to get competitive. Well, I was very lucky when I was at UVA. I found the original Harrie Lindeberg monograph in the stacks in the architecture library. And it had not been checked out in years and years. It was dusty and musty, and I fell in love with the work. And I basically checked it out for my 3 years at UVA. And when I got back to New York, started my architectural career, I started with a great firm in New York, and about a year into it, I was presented with the great opportunity to be the project architect on the renovation of Harrie Lindeberg's own house on Long Island, which was like, how could this happen? I knew it very well from the monograph. It's been really pretty thoroughly photographed. And it was an amazing education because I think if we had access to the Cummings house, we could walk through and see detail after detail after detail that were original and fascinating and subtle. And that's what this guy was all about. It was very, very subtle. I felt a little guilty because I was comparing Adler to Lindeberg the other night. And I don't think I quite gave David Adler enough praise because I kept saying that Lindeberg was a little more modern, maybe a little more original, maybe a little more forward-thinking. And then I remembered as I was walking around looking at some Adler houses here yesterday, he was a magician. His work, I don't care if it was classical, if it was modern, if it was traditional, there's a magic to these houses that everybody who sees them feels it. So I just wanted to apologize to David Allen for maybe giving him a little bit of short shrift because I was focusing on Harrie Lindeberg.
You did start out by saying this is his, whatever the doorway was, considered the perfect doorway, and people come around to measure it.
Yeah.
So I think starting with the idea that he had created perfection probably covered the grounds.
I just felt I felt like I was hammering the Lindeberg story pretty hard, and I thought, I don't know how David Allen did it, but when I saw that book, the first time I saw that book, it really they just sing. They just sing. There's magic there. So, and I think Lindeberg did the same thing. A little more intellectual, a little more, maybe masculine, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, two really brilliant architects. So, and Lake Forest is certainly the only place in the world where you have multiple examples. I don't think Adler ever did a project on Long Island, which is odd, or Connecticut. Am I wrong?
He did.
He did?
Summerfield slide.
Oh, which was torn down, yeah. I've been on that property. That damn shame. The two little wing buildings are still there. The little
In the townhouse in New York.
Oh, right. That got torn down 20 years later. Poor David.
Happens.
The Cummings house, I couldn't remember the name of it.
You say that.
Right, I didn't want to say wrong. That was always on that property was vacant forever and ever. But the only picture I've ever seen of the house is the one you showed in the film, and that's from a little book of houses from Lincoln. And does anybody know anything about that house? I know the coach house was the one that was built onto across the street, but the houses, what about that house? Anything, do you know anything about it?
We have very little information here on it. Again, it doesn't seem to be heavily, documentation does not remain on a lot of the earliest houses. We do our best to find anything we can around what the footprint was, but there are several houses in which there's not a lot. So in the back room and then up here.
Do you know how many owners have been in the Cummings house, and when the Cummings family would have first changed hands and went out of their family?
Do you know that? Because I did not.
I don't. I think the last owners before the current owners were there for 25 years, so it could easily have been that was the first time it changed hands. I think a lot of those houses changed hands for the first time in the 70s and 80s, were built in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, I don't think it's a lot of owners, but no, I don't know off the top of my head.
Four owners.
I think because there was a family there, four of the ones that just moved out before Chase, and they were there like the whole time, I remember.
Oh.
And I just remember they always had that big black limousine right in front of the front door. Every day was just sitting out like rain.
Oh, I wish I could have seen that.
You went to an IRS foreclosure.
Oh, really?
That was more recent, wasn't it? Oh, yeah, well, that's me, that's recent.
And then it had two owners after that.
So we've got some dirt.
I was just curious as to what the price might have been to build the house initially and what approximately it might be worth today.
I know Lori had what it cost to build it, and I don't know if she said. It was not insubstantial. And I don't know what it's valued at today, but I know that, for a lot of those houses, one of the most interesting parts of those houses is the construction cost about the same as what the interior design and furnishings cost for a lot of the estates in that era. It was just sort of expected that you would invest that same amount within the inside as you did in the outside of the building.
It is interesting because I'm always interested in this too, and I study a lot of these old houses, and it's astonishing when you read, see a house like that, and they'll sort of preface it by saying the average house in 1927 cost $3,000 to build. In this house, they spent $75,000 to build it. It's like the cost of 25 houses. So if you said today the average house costs $300,000 to build, and you multiply that by 25, which I can't do in my head very rapidly, but it's always amazing to me when you read what they cost. They rarely, a house like that, it would shock me if it cost more than $200,000 to build it, but you could have built an entire neighborhood of 50 houses for $200,000. So now, let's say it's worth $8 million.
Well, the other thing is that you would have had access to a lot of fine craftsmen who would have been here already working. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting when you look at the Charlotte area is how many woodworkers we have who are able to do this work, all of the decorative work in there, plaster workers. I mean, we have really strong trained presence of a lot of people who've gotten European training around the crafts that were required to keep these places looking the way they did, which is why 100 years later the wood is still there and it still looks beautiful. It is interesting when you start to look at that era, who was coming in and what crafts they were bringing with them, and then how it got translated into the homes here.
Yeah, so regarding the Cummings house, the land footprint, is that the original or has it been subdivided? Does anyone know?
It's the same. So that those quadrants remain the same, and it's not no section has been split off since then.
And were there homes to the east of it? I think, having been down the street, it looks like there were homes that are like across the street to the east of it. Like, was that just land in the block, or where are they?
I think something big was torn down there. It was a family house, and I think it was torn down. Maybe so that other members of the family built smaller houses, but I'm not sure. I think that's all that.
I know it was across the street.
Yeah.
Oh, was it on the lake? It would make sense.
I hope it was across the street from there.
Well, that was probably the land that where those three houses are.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love the community solving story. I'm like, I don't know, I have to go back to the
It was a compound, a Cummings compound.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that back then. Any other questions? All right, well, I want to say thank you to Greg for coming in from North Carolina for these 2 days of presentations. It's been a joy working with you on these projects.
You too, Carol. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and I just want to make a brief pitch. So the exhibit that we just ended was in partnership with Lake Forest College on the 50th anniversary. Our next exhibit will open on November 11th on the art of the miniatures, which is focused on Narcissa Thorne's development of the 1/12 scale rooms. We have the son of the main craftsman that she worked with, Eugene Kupchak, coming in for that event. And he continues to be a miniaturist to this day. We will have 4 of his rooms on display, and then at least 8 other rooms, all from private collections. So none of this is the stuff you see at the Art Institute. This is all new and different, and the focus will really be on the craftsmanship that goes into these rooms. And as Greg got a sneak preview can attest, the craftsmanship is brilliant on these things. It's quite amazing.
Unbelievable.
So for gold members and above, there is a private preview the 10th where there's a meet and greet with Jay and some of the other craftsmen, and then the 11th will open for the public. I do hope you come back to see this exhibit. We are very excited by it. Is there anything else? So George always wraps things up with all the things I have forgotten.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carol, so much, and thank you, Greg, again, for such an incredible discussion following that film. Carol touched on a lot of the upcoming programming, and for anyone who's attended Thursday's program knows we have a couple other things to be excited for as well. We do have some outdoor activities, like I mentioned, our tour of Lake Forest Cemetery, which will be on the 6th of November. So if you are still looking for something to do that weekend, we still have registration available for that. And to supplement the Art of the Miniature exhibit, we will be having miniature-themed programming through March of 2023. So you can continuously check on our main website. If you are a member, you will receive a weekly newsletter that will tell you all of the upcoming programs centered around that. It'll be a lot of lectures, panel discussions, and some other kind of supplementary programming to keep the theme very in the front-facing part of this History Center. So I also wanted to mention once again that this program and Thursdays were both sponsored by the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation and by Pam and David Watt. So thank you to both of those parties for helping us put on these programs. I also mentioned just as on Thursday evening that programs like these are free because of the support of our membership base and those that give continuous donations. So if you enjoyed what you saw today, we have a couple other membership explanation pamphlets that we created that are brand new, as well as some information on our garden and endowment initiative that you're free to take some brochures, see if that's something that you would be willing to contribute to so that we can continue to provide programs like this for the future. So with all that, thank you again to both our panelists and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.